Thank you to everybody who's forgotten the excitement around the corner to be here. I hope not too many people will have to rush out for a little Twitter break. Okay, so the title of this speech, The Ties That Bind, it's not an original phrase. And as soon as the invitations for this policy exchange event went out, we had a phone call from an understandably bemused Lords Committee clerk, wondering why they haven't been consulted, because their Committee on Citizenship and Civic Engagement published a report with that title earlier this year, and one of my colleagues actually gave evidence to it. So I have to apologise to Lord Hodgson and his eminent fellow peers. I hadn't even seen their excellent report at the time we chose the title, but I have now read it with great interest. And of course, a great deal of overdue thinking and discussion has happened in many quarters in recent years on the difficult subjects of community cohesion, integration, citizenship and British values by minds that are far more distinguished than mine. And when I took up this job of Chief Inspector, I hardly imagined that this was a subject that I'd be spending quite so much of my time on. But after 18 months in what's a fairly hot seat at Ofsted, I've seen quite how much these challenges are directly affecting our schools. So that's my topic this evening, to explore why the promotion of British values is important in encouraging cohesion and integration, and so why responsibility for promoting them must fall to our schools. And I also want to talk about Ofsted's role in making sure that schools do this well. If I take a step back for a few minutes, it was the experience of living and working in the United States more than 20 years ago that made me recognise how much the development of a society and the formation of its public policy is driven by the values that underlie that society. Even though the UK and the US are more similar than most, I came to realise how different their underlying values and assumptions are, and were and still are. And I'm not talking just about guns and abortions here. I was most struck then about things like the welfare settlement and the whole idea of what education is for. The version of egalitarianism that's been the bedrock of NHS provision and of the English state school system for many decades looks quite strange to many American eyes. And I was genuinely surprised back then by how very differently the word liberalism was perceived in America. And all of this made me look back and think about Britain in a whole different way. But in spite of those differences, what marks out both the US and the UK as successful societies is that they've each developed a core of values that are shared by a large majority of their citizens, safe in the assumption that, despite the range of political opinion, enough consensus exists around values for people to compromise where necessary in the collective interest. Though perhaps the limits of that consensus are being somewhat stretched by the current occupant of the White House. This assumption of shared values has worked well for a couple of reasons. And the US has famously put a strong emphasis on national unity and assimilation, to an extent that actually makes many British people feel slightly uneasy. So, for example, the Pledge of Allegiance must be recited regularly in schools in all but 4 states. In England, the nearest requirement the nearest analogue is the requirement for a daily act of collective worship, which I think, if we're being honest, gets lip service, if that, in many schools. And more generally, England has had a much more laissez-faire approach to integration, with multiculturalism and assimilation both valued. But the context, it really has changed in recent years. Immigrant populations, they're quite unevenly distributed. And so, in many parts of England, we now have schools that educate mainly, or almost entirely, children from relatively recently arrived families, or that at least use another language at home. For instance, across England, there are just under 2,000 state-funded schools where more than half the children have English as an additional language, and more than 40% of EAL children are in that relatively small minority of schools where half or more of children are EAL. Even the accidental segregation that results from geography makes it less likely that integration will happen by default. In December 2016, the Casey Review was published. Louise Casey is here. More recently, the government's Integrated Community Strategy Green Paper was published in March this year. And it sets out starkly the scale of the challenge and the need for every organ of the state to play an active role in fostering integration. And that strategy, I think, it's a clear recognition that the current approach to integration needs strengthening, and that our efforts to promote community cohesion must involve a common vision, a sense of belonging, valuing diversity, and ensuring equal opportunities. The work of school in promoting British values sits at the heart of that strategy. Now, the current meaning of that term, British values, was first defined in the 2011 Prevent strategy, and the role of schools in promoting them was formalised in Department for Education guidance in 2014 to help both independent and state schools understand their responsibilities. And this guidance, it sets out the duty of all schools in England, state and independent, to actively promote the four British values of democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, and, the mouthful, of mutual respect for and tolerance of those with different faiths and beliefs. Like many, I recognise the wider significance of these values. They ensure the legitimacy and effectiveness of government for all citizens, and they provide a unifying framework for a multiracial society to build on what's already held in common. They're values that promote both trust and the willingness to contribute to the common good. And they create a space in which minority beliefs, lifestyles, and cultures can exist freely and in harmony, but also a common set of values that help to strengthen the bonds of our shared society. They therefore have an importance that goes far beyond preventing extremism and terrorism. So for Ofsted, making sure that the next generation understands and respects and is willing to adopt these values is essential. They're values that give a simple message to our young people. In Britain, no matter what your background, you can fit in, you can succeed, and you can belong. The Lords Committee, in its response to the Green Paper, endorses the values strongly. I'll quote them. Our first conclusion is that while a variety of faiths, beliefs, and customs can enrich our society, and respect for the values of others is a high priority, respect for the law must come first. There is no place for rules or customs whose effect is to demean or marginalise people or groups. Equality before the law is a cornerstone of our society. And this is why the rule of law, together with a commitment to democracy, individual liberty, and respect for the inherent worth and autonomy of all people, are the shared values of British citizenship from which everything else proceeds. These are red lines which have to be defended. Strong statement. The government believes that promoting British values in schools helps young people leave school prepared for life in modern Britain. If that's our aim, then it must be right that Ofsted inspects against this policy. We know that this belief is shared by many people in education, and yet we do not go unchallenged in our work. The Lords Committee noted that many people regret the context in which these values were originally formulated, in the context of a counter-extremism strategy. It suggested that they need to be reframed in a non-securitised and more positive context. They expressed a desire to rename them as shared values of British citizenship, as well as broadening the scope of respect beyond matters of faith and belief. But the most frequent criticism expressed to me is that the values are universal and not exclusively British. People who make this criticism often prefer a model grounded in individual human rights. But I'm not aware that any claim has ever been made for British ownership of the list, and indeed, as the Lords Committee said in its argument for renaming them, this does not imply that no other country can share them in whole or in part, but that they are civic values which should be adhered to by all people in Britain. Values which stand in opposition cannot and should not be described as British. And therein lies the point. While these values are not unique to Britain or British society, they are integral to our ethos. And these values are in fact far from universal. A few months ago, after similar points had been made to me for the umpteenth time, I did a little empirical investigation of my own. There are a number of international surveys by credible organisations that compare different countries on things like democracy and the rule of law, I looked for and found fairly recent surveys covering all four values. For democracy, there's the EIU Democracy Index. For the rule of law, the World Justice Project Index. For liberty, I found the Cato Institute Freedom Index. And for religious tolerance, a Pew Centre Index of religious restrictions. Now, while religious restrictions are a slightly different thing, their existence generally goes along with unequal treatment of different religions, so I've taken this index as a proxy measure. Each of these surveys covers a number of countries, and they cover not just intent, whether a value is recognised and publicly endorsed, but also whether it is realised in practice. So these four surveys give some perspective on the universality or otherwise of the four core values. And the EIU Democracy Index is an interesting place to start. It surveys 167 countries, which between them account for the vast majority of the world population. It categorises just 19 countries, which between them have less than 5% of the world population, as full democracies, and a further 57 countries, with another 44% of the world population, as flawed democracies. That puts more than half of the countries covered and more than half of the population in either the authoritarian regime or hybrid regime categories. About 32% of people live in authoritarian countries. And it's a sad fact that in recent years, more countries have moved away from full democracy than towards it. The World Justice Project for the rule of law, that similarly finds that surprisingly few countries get a pretty clean bill of health. 11 are graded very high, and a further 11 as high. The Pew Centre looks at all 198 countries and territories and scores about half as having low government restrictions on religion. But a surprising number, even of European countries, are deemed to have moderate, or even in a couple of places, high restrictions. Now, one can always quibble with aspects of the classification in these surveys, and the boundaries are obviously not clear-cut. But a surprisingly small number of countries come out consistently in the top group on all of these criteria. On the particular set of surveys I looked at, it was 6: Australia, Canada, Finland, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and the UK. The World Justice Project didn't include some smaller countries. Ireland and Luxembourg might have joined the select group if it had. The other Scandinavian and German-speaking countries all missed out by reason of the Pew Centre scoring of religious restrictions. Widening to the top 2 categories across the board would have brought them in, along with the United States, a few in the Far East, and, interestingly, Uruguay. But what's striking, I think, is how many countries would still be absent from the list. There are a lot of countries that are not democracies, and a lot that do not permit their citizens religious freedom, or do very much to protect individual liberty. And the rule of law is so imperfectly implemented in many countries that it's hard to attach a great deal of value to it. That such a small handful of countries fall into the category of fully embracing what we call British values should be, I think, proof enough that we cannot simply take them for granted. And nor can we assume that because they exist now, they always will. To illustrate this, consider a recent US poll commissioned by the Bush and Biden foundations. It found that a majority of Americans, 55%, now label American democracy as weak, with 2/3 saying it's getting weaker. A startling study of attitudes to democracy by Yasha Mank and Roberto Foa found that while in Britain almost 70% of those born in the 1930s think it's essential to live in a democracy, that figure falls to just over 25% for those born in the 1980s. That bears thinking about, that barely more than a quarter of so-called millennials in this country believe that democracy is essential. Now, some of the reasons for this are well documented. Poorly managed economic dislocation, combined with the abuse by some of their positions of wealth and authority, have led to disenchantment with the status quo. That disenchantment can so easily be exploited by extremists who promise a better tomorrow by scapegoating and blaming minorities today. This is why it's right that the Prevent duty also focuses on tackling the growth of the far right. But at the opposite but strikingly similar end of the spectrum, Islamist extremists, particularly fuelled by the online propaganda of Daesh and others, prey on a sense of isolation and alienation in some minority communities. And of course, this poses a number of problems for schools. The first is that schools, with the job of promoting British values and equalities, are sometimes teaching young people who get conflicting or even downright contradictory messages outside school. For example, freedom of belief. It is inimical to the prevailing view in some communities. Similarly, the acceptance of the equal rights of women or of gay rights may not fit with the views that a child hears at home. No wonder, therefore, that some young people feel torn between different identities. Yet in many ways, this is not a new challenge, but a constant one. Attitudes can and do shift over time, but they don't change in an ordered way. And the studies I just quoted show how they can move in both directions. Just look at how much British society has changed in the past century or two. The dismantling of restrictions on Catholics was completed less than 2 centuries ago. Legal equality for women was achieved in my lifetime, after a century of gradual progress, starting probably with the Married Women's Property Act. Equality for gay men and women, more recently still. And transgender rights are still not fully secured, something that last week's government action plan seeks to address. And social attitude surveys from 50 or even 20 years ago show a dramatically different picture. For example, in 1987, only a generation ago, only 11% of the British public said that same-sex relationships are not wrong at all. And yet, by 2016, this had reached 64%. That's one problem. A second problem for schools is that history, culture, and experience can lead to a strong identification by a child with their family's cultural group to the exclusion of all else. To quote a recent piece by Andrew Sullivan, the problem with tribalism is that it knows no real limiting principle. It triggers a deep and visceral response, a defence of the tribe before all other considerations. That means, in its modern manifestation, that the tribe comes before the country as a whole, before any neutral institutions that get in its way, before reason and empiricism, and before the rule of law. It means loyalty to the tribe and its current chief is enforced relentlessly. And because I am not saying here that it's a problem for people to belong to a well-defined group or groups, whether political, religious, cultural, geographic, or simply social. Indeed, there are well-documented advantages to belonging to communities. Where it becomes problematic is when a particular identity is taken to preclude, or at worst, to justify hostility to any other group affiliation. And the increasing fragmentation of the media probably makes the problem worse. Rather than engaging in and debating a common narrative, such as the one provided by broadcast news at 6 or 10, people use social media to follow news sources that reinforce rather than challenge their views. Among majority communities, this can lead to a desire to blame the other. It can lead to the backlash against minorities and against liberalism that we've seen across the globe in recent years. Combined with economic malaise, it can lead to a rejection of the move towards social liberalism of the last half-century. As Robert Putnam says, social dislocation can easily breed a reactionary form of nostalgia, where minority communities are already feeling isolated and alienated. They can themselves be preyed upon by extremists, making the job of schools even harder. And the third practical difficulty for schools is that education, rightly, is seen neither by policymakers nor by teachers as indoctrination. Education should not and does not aim to force children to adhere to British values and to disclaim all others, nor does it try to turn children against their parents or their cultural heritage. But yet we know that some teachers feel unclear about, or even uncomfortable with what's expected of schools. So let me explain what I think is being asked of them. In my view, teachers are expected to give children a proper understanding of British values and of what these values have contributed and continue to contribute to the strength and success of British society. The Lords Committee sees the need as being for better citizenship education. It calls for a statutory entitlement with inevitably extra focus by Ofsted and an explicit link to the outstanding judgment. That, of course, is a question for the government. But regardless, I would argue that there's much more that can be done within the existing school curriculum, and in particular, across all the humanities. So, taking the history curriculum, for example, the Key Stage 3 statutory programme of study includes the suggested topics: the struggle between church and crown, Magna Carta and the emergence of Parliament, the English Reformation and Counter-Reformation, the Elizabethan religious settlement and conflict with Catholics, Britain's transatlantic slave trade, its effects and its eventual abolition, the French Revolutionary Wars, and women's suffrage. And many of these topics both show how the four values have come about and can also bring home how many lives it's cost to establish and to protect them. So, for example, the persecution of Catholics in England in the 16th century highlights the suffering that can follow from the absence of religious freedom. And some topics in modern history, such as the study of the Holocaust or, say, Stalinist Russia, serve particularly well to illustrate the terrible human cost of totalitarianism and of prejudice against minorities. Similarly, the study of geography can also be used to look at where physical, political, ethnic and religious borders coincide and at where they don't, and at how the resulting distributions of people and of economic and political power translate into accommodations and conflicts, economic development or its absence, and into patterns of migration. Religious education can also contribute a great deal to mutual understanding in a multi-ethnic state. And while it can be quite straightforward to cover the factual information about the rituals and observances and meeting places of different faiths, there is far more that it can do. During my time at Ofqual, the exam regulator, we worked on the new Religious Studies GCSE, which for the first time is requiring students to study 2 religions. And this means that they study at least one that is not their own, so arriving at some understanding of the differences between faiths. And religious education also has the potential to develop children's understanding of the diversity that exists within as well as between faiths. After all, most faiths actually encompass a spectrum of views from liberal to conservative. And religious education done well helps children understand where values overlap and where they diverge, and hence the tensions that can arise between and sometimes even within faiths. It can help them understand the tensions that can arise between faith and other legally established rights, such as the rights of women and the rights relating to sexuality. And done well, it allows children to understand how their own faith relates to the wider world, both in terms of attitudes and the prevailing law. Again, this is not about indoctrination. It's about making sure that young people have the knowledge to make their own informed choices. This is one of the many reasons that I've been putting so much emphasis on the importance of the curriculum, the real substance of education. I've talked before about why I believe a rich and deep knowledge-based curriculum is a vital driver of social mobility. But there's another reason that the curriculum is vitally important in preparing young people for life in modern Britain. A shared body of knowledge is the building blocks of a coherent society. It gives young people an understanding of the forces that have shaped and continue to shape their history and nation. It helps them be discriminating about fake news and siren voices. And EBAC, it isn't just about helping young people to fulfil their own academic potential. It's about the various branches of knowledge that are vital to the functioning of a shared society. And we've seen firsthand the consequences of locking young people out of that shared corpus, of denying them the opportunity to engage with the best that's been thought and said. I believe that the alienation that we see in some communities, whether they're segregated ethnic communities or isolated white working class communities, is in part the result of an education that just hasn't given their young people the tools that they need to be active and engaged and constructive citizens. And I want to turn now to our recent experience, drawing on our inspection findings. So Ofsted is, of course, on the front line in observing and reporting on individual schools and on whether the government's education policy is translating into good practice. When it comes to British values, we often see an oddly piecemeal approach, which too seldom builds the teaching into a strong context. One strange example I saw myself that illustrates the tendency to superficiality was in a prison classroom. The lesson was about writing a business plan, and it was all perfectly sensible stuff, setting out the business idea clearly, knowing who your customers were going to be, how you were going to sell your product, how you were going to price it, and so on. And then the teacher suddenly said, and of course, you have to make sure that the plan reflects British values, and started asking students how they would build each value into their plan. In another non-faith schools policy that I saw recently, they explain that one of the ways they teach fundamental British values is through looking at the seasons and the weather, which is surely stretching the definition a bit. More generally, we see a lot of wall displays and motivational assemblies, but not much coherent thinking about how a real depth of understanding can be built through the academic curriculum, such as the history examples I gave a few minutes ago. Though, as ever, there are some excellent counterexamples. I have learned in 18 months at Ofsted that I cannot give a speech that mentions a common but not universal deficiency without first, some expressions of outrage that I've claimed that everyone is deficient, and secondly, at least one follow-up invitation to a school that does that thing particularly well. I only wish I could visit everyone who writes to me. But I am, however, hoping that our renewed focus on curriculum will encourage schools to think more about what they're teaching and about what they're aiming to get from that teaching. And we should particularly remember that for some children, school may be the only time in their lives that they spend time every day with people from outside their immediate ethnic or religious group, or at least somewhere that the values of people outside their own group can be explained and discussed openly. And this is a good point to talk about faith schools and our inspections of them. I've mentioned in several other speeches that almost all faith schools do a good job of explaining any tensions between the tenets of their own faith and the framework of law and policy. Ofsted recognises and frequently acknowledges this publicly. And more generally, I want to be absolutely unequivocal. Ofsted has no anti-faith bias or secular agenda. Where faith schools are performing well, they'll continue to be recognised and celebrated by Ofsted. And we're also working with a variety of faith groups to help them understand our work better and to make sure that our inspectors always have the right level of understanding of how these groups practice their faith. So to give one example, we've got a collaboration with Pages, the Partnership for Jewish Schools, to run information sessions for Jewish school leaders on how they can comply with requirements around equalities and British values in a way that's in line with schools' religious teachings. And overall, my view is that the accommodation of religion in state education that was put in place back in 1870 has actually worked remarkably well for nearly 150 years. Today we do see many faith schools playing a pivotal role in promoting integration. Through accidents of history, many Catholic and Church of England schools are quite ethnically diverse. Catholic schools, perhaps because the Catholic Church is one single international church, and Church of England schools because, alongside the traditional village primary, a large number of church schools are concentrated in historic centres of population where immigrants form a large proportion of the population, and so have intakes that are quite diverse, ethnically and religiously. And Simon Burgess's recently published study shows that pupils from one ethnic group feel more positive towards another ethnic group if they encounter more pupils from that group in their school. Even small moves away from mono-ethnic schools towards more mixed ones produce positive changes. In fact, for all of the UK's major religions, the values of kindness, charity, fair treatment and respect for others are integral to the faith ethos that they inculcate in their schools. In most faith schools, that ethos encourages integration and a sense of community that goes beyond the confines of that particular religion. And these strengths are borne out in our inspection judgments. Muslim state schools are actually three times as likely to be outstanding than the national average, and Jewish and Christian state schools are also more likely to be good or outstanding than their secular counterparts. The suggestion that Ofsted has an anti-faith school bias is simply not true, and it doesn't fit the profile of our judgments. Digging into some inspection reports clearly shows that it's possible to adhere to a faith while respecting the requirements of equalities law. So, for example, the report for Eden School in Waltham Forest, a Muslim girls' school, says that the development of pupils' spiritual, moral, social and cultural development is outstanding. Pupils' faith systems lead to their participating in worship at the start of lessons and demonstrating respect and understanding of the values of the other faiths studied. Pupils live diversity, they're insightful about what it means to uphold British values, they're exceptionally well prepared to live and serve in modern Britain. Many non-faith schools could probably learn a lot from Eden School's approach. Another school, Simon Mark's Jewish Primary, had a report in a similar vein. The promotion of pupils' spiritual, moral, social and cultural development, sorry, that's the statutory phrase, is a key strength of the school. It permeates all subjects and all aspects of school life. Leaders map out topics and enrichment experiences to ensure that no opportunity is missed to discuss and learn about key values, including the fundamental British values of tolerance, respect, democracy and the rule of law. For example, following the terrorist acts in London and Manchester, pupils reflected on all the religions they've learnt about and decided that no religion would condone such actions. And to give just one more example, from St Damian's Roman Catholic Science College in Ashton-under-Lyne, the phrase is coming again, spiritual, moral, social and cultural education of pupils is impressive. Pupils are regularly immersed in rich, well-organised opportunities. As a result, pupils are well prepared for life in modern Britain. Leaders organise theme days, aspire days, to enable pupils to understand the concept of British values. Pupils have the opportunity to learn about and discuss cultural diversity and faiths such as Hinduism and Islam. Yet, we have seen worrying developments in a small number of state schools, as well as in some independent schools, and in unregistered provision. As I previously had to report, we do find schools where teaching materials and practices are directly at odds with the requirements of the law, especially the independent school standards and equalities law. But there are other problems too that have been less well aired. First, we see an expanding sense of religious and or cultural entitlement to have aspects of a school's provision dictated by the preferences of a particular group, whether or not members of that group even constitute the majority of a school's intake. This can affect what's taught and what is not taught, what children take part in and what they're withdrawn from, and what children wear or don't wear. And people have even questioned why Ofsted has expressed a view in some recent cases. So here are my reasons. First, we need to recognise that where this kind of pressure builds up, it can not only undermine the authority of a head, but also limit the extent to which schools can help build community cohesion and encourage integration. Ofsted must support schools that make justifiable decisions in the interests of all the children who attend their school. Secondly, we see in some of the more extreme cases that religious group identity and authority are being systematically built up and used to limit individual liberties, such as the right of a girl to enjoy the same freedoms and opportunities as a boy. We made a difficult call in the case of Al Hijra School in Birmingham, that the segregation practiced there infringed the law, and our inspector's view was upheld in the Court of Appeal. And thirdly, we do see a few schools that set out to withhold from children the knowledge of aspects of science and society that fall squarely within the national curriculum, that's the default expectation for all children, but that are deemed incompatible with the relevant faith. And here I'm not just talking about issues relating to evolution, to reproduction and social sexual orientation. A recent state school inspection found that Elizabethan history, chunks of GCSE set text such as a Sherlock Holmes novel, and most works of art were considered unsuitable for the girls to know about. For a time, exam was allowed some schools to censor exam papers, even where this meant breaking the rules that protect the integrity of tests. Again, I want to stress, we're talking about a small minority of faith schools here. Most faith schools introduce relevant knowledge at the appropriate time with clear explanation of any differences between the principles of their faith and British law and the beliefs of others. And indeed, it's worth being clear here on the difference between the requirements around British values and equalities law. British values must be actively promoted, including the mutual respect and tolerance of those with different faiths and beliefs. But schools are not required to promote social practices or opinions or lifestyles that they disagree with. Instead, the requirement is for them to convey that these differences exist among us and are recognised and protected in British law. In the context of these developments, it's clear that there is a tradition of liberal tolerance across the whole education system that defaults to accommodating religious preferences. Faith itself is, to use the somewhat clunky language of equalities law, one of the 9 protected characteristics. And we often take this preference for accommodating religion in particular, quite far. Even non-religious people often feel that the preferences of religious groups must be accommodated, and even when this means that some children will not receive their full curriculum entitlement. So, when I've talked about muscular liberalism in the past, it's been about the confidence to sustain our openness and tolerance, and not allow them to be used to accept models of education in this country that close minds and narrow opportunity. All children are born equal, and should know this, and know what life opportunities they have, whether or not they choose to take advantage of them in their adult lives. And that should apply just as much in Scunthorpe as in Hackney as in Cheshire. The draft advice to schools on the independent school standards is rightly clear that the requirement to promote the value of respect for others is not met just by encouraging respect for other people in a general way without any explanation of the protected characteristics. And it's regrettable that we at Ofsted are experiencing increasing hostility from a few schools to law and policy that do not fit well with the preferences of the most conservative religious groups and to the parts of government that inspect and regulate. Some groups are quick to allege bias or antagonism on the part of inspectors, and sometimes simply to misrepresent the inspection process. The fact that we found significant shortcomings in a relatively high proportion of schools in the independent sector is alleged to be evidence of a bias against religion, even though no such difference is identifiable in outcomes for schools in the state sector. Our inspectors find and report on truth as they see it, in line with the law. And one part of that law, the Equalities Act, is a relatively new piece of legislation. Resolving tensions between the different protected characteristics, it's never going to be clear-cut. But as with so much of the messy British Constitution, the law probably gets the balance about right. But if people have a problem with it, they should probably be lobbying MPs to change the law, not blaming Ofsted for carrying out its duty to apply the law as it stands. And I hope all this has explained why Ofsted has a role in this sensitive space and the importance of us reporting honestly on what we're finding, because this is how the next generation is being shaped to enter society. And my final point is to emphasise the importance of making these subjects discussable. For too many people, the things I've been talking about today are too sensitive and too difficult for them to want to risk giving offence. They're easy things to skirt, but the risk of doing so is great. If we leave these topics to the likes of the EDL and BNP on the one hand and Islamists on the other, then the mission of integration will fail. And to quote Robert Putnam once more, people divorced from community, occupation and association are first and foremost among the supporters of extremism. Putting this back into the more concrete language that I used earlier, schools have an extraordinarily important role in making sure that children can fit in, succeed and belong. Ofsted's role is to apply the lever of inspection to help make sure they do it well. Thank you.
Time now for questions. Members of the rather long hands up. Can I just see a paper from the wants to ask a question? Just wait till you the microphone comes. Name and organisation, please.
I'm in option for personals. I was the chairman of these referred to by the speaker. And I appreciate a very impressive speech. And thank you for the short half that come and give everyone. And for kind quoting of our report, and in particular the issue of red lines and looking the other way in an option. Thank you for that, and may I also support comments very much about everything must be discussed. That is very, very good. But I don't like the hand that's just patting me. But the fact of the matter is that the committee found that the best description of our citizens' education in the last 10 to 15 years has been one of the benign things. And I'm afraid Ofsted has played its part in overseeing that benign things. There is simply not enough teachers being trained to fill the gaps. The teaching is far too often just book-based with no experiential experience at all. It's too often confused with PSHE, which is internal as an external. And overall, we really felt that it was being treated as a second tier, not a second-rate subject. And you referred to our recommendation that there should be a statutory entitlement to citizenship education. That was why we reached that conclusion, because all that we saw was that there was this benign neglect going on unless there was some way to force a change through.
Thank you. Okay, I'll just make a couple of points then. One is that I very much like to see sort of real depth to education in these areas, but as I say, I think that there is so much that the main curriculum, that actually a strong understanding comes from building it into the other study that children have. So there may well be an increased role for citizenship education, but I don't think it's just about that. I think there's something that's already happening that much more could be drawn from. And the other piece, and the boring side of it, is that long before I started, the inspection model was reduced and simplified to take out subject-specific, the subject-specific inspection that once existed. So we have a limited amount of time and resource in the context of given inspection to look at any one subject. So we have to take a sort of holistic view of what's happening in the school rather than reporting on every piece individually. But I take your point. It's something that is very important.
Lady there in the middle, name and organisation.
Excuse me, sorry, trying to read this. Thank you for that. I really enjoyed your talk. Before England played Colombia last week, I was talking to my 12-year-old and she was commenting on people with England flags, and she says, well, that's a bit racist, isn't it? And I was quite surprised that she'd taken that view, that any sense of national pride, even associated with the England football team, was something to actually be a bit embarrassed about, a bit ashamed about, that it had overtones of being a bit racist, isn't it really? And my concern is that I can see what you're suggesting about the curriculum, how the curriculum could be used to promote a positive view of English values, but at the moment it seems that too often it's precisely the opposite that's the case, that the history lessons are being taught to teach the evils of empire, which is not me suggesting that there's positive things to be taught there, but when the emphasis is solely on the evils of empire, that the English curriculum has been problematised because dead white men are inherently problematic and it needs to be decolonised even at the school level is the message that's going out. And when the geography curriculum is about teaching global citizenship to the detriment of any view of national citizenship, I think the message that comes too often is that there's something just a bit embarrassing and a bit shameful about having any sense of national pride. And I was not surprised, but it did make me wonder about your statistic that you quoted about 25% of people born after 1980 believe in having little faith in democracy. Because, you know, just doing the maths on that, that means that there are people under the age of 38, which would be quite a lot of the proportion of school teachers under the age of 38. I wonder to what extent people can be expected to teach a positive view of democracy when they don't actually have that view themselves, when their own view of democracy, particularly in relation to Brexit, many teachers seem to be, well, we need to educate children out of the kinds of values that brought about Brexit, which seems to me to be inherently at odds with democracy.
You made a series of interesting points there, many of which I agree with. To give you an example, to link to what you've said, I was struck not very long ago reading a teacher railing on Twitter about how he was forced to teach the slave trade as having been a good thing. And it sent me back to the national curriculum to say, really, I don't think so. And the words in the national curriculum are exactly the ones that I quoted here. Britain's transatlantic slave trade, its effects and its eventual abolition. That seems to me to be completely devoid of value-laden terms. And so I think there is something odd here, and it's part of why I think this focus that we've got on curriculum and on trying to make sure that in inspection we probe what the school is setting out to teach and how, and sort of unpack things that may be being loaded in on top of the national curriculum, or that are taking us away from a very carefully and I think sort of fair and balanced curriculum to something rather different in practice. So that's how I think we can contribute.
Lady at the front there. Just wait till the microphone comes so people can hear. Name an organisation.
Just wondering,
Name an organisation.
how do you think it's possible for teachers that can be made to teach the way you want from knowledge-based curriculum? Do you think that the teachers' training quality is good enough? Train teachers to be good teachers. There's so many teachers as your predecessors have said, are just not as good as they should be. And also their projects have been reviewed by their students and their own school experience, but there's been a lot of stuff done. How do you say, these proposals about the shameful is that children can be decolonized. And how do you think that would change?
I think I'm a little more optimistic than you. Every teacher is part of a school, which is a system which is capable of putting a framework around what happens that's stronger than any one individual, and most schools are themselves part of a bigger system. So I think by looking at schools to see whether they are building those kinds of systems, that kind of resilience, that kind of strength, not just at whether individual teachers at the end of the chain are teaching a good lesson. Changing that focus helps to see whether that strength and quality that can develop teachers within it is being built.
Lady at the front here. Just wait till the microphone comes so people. Name an organisation, please.
My name is Sylvia Storms. I'm Assistant Director of the Council of Disabled Children. I want to sort of highlight some of the things that you've said, which I think point to an important omission from the way that the agenda has been addressed. You've talked about the importance of tolerance of difference, the importance of pupils encountering pupils from different backgrounds, all children born equal, and on the negative side, the impact of locking out, of segregating communities, You've talked about the history, cultural experiences, the backlash against minorities, persecution of minorities in history. And we have currently increases in exclusions of young people with special education needs and disabilities, increased special school placements, disproportionate bullying of disabled pupils and pupils with special education needs, increases in elective home education. We have more children out of school waiting places. It seems to me that there is a deep cultural issue here which omits disability from the equalities agenda. If you analyse recent speeches by ministers and secretaries of state, you find that there is an emphasis on stretching and challenging our most able pupils and helping and supporting those who struggle with their learning, not stretch and challenge for those who may be struggling with their learning. It seems to me that this is one of the areas that really should be addressed in the same way that we are addressing the cultural issues. If you think about the persecution of disabled people in history, if you think about, if you like, the struggle we're having to make them ensure they're included adequately in our education system, I think this is an agenda we should really be addressing through this cultural perspective to address some of the sort of systems problems with acceptance of disabled.
Thank you. Well, there is a lot that Ofsted does in this space. I've spoken a number of times recently about some of the concerning trends in off-rolling. We do a lot of work on our LA Send inspections, for example, but they simply weren't the topic of this speech, which was about the British values and how they're implemented or not implemented, and where we see problems. So I take your point, but it would be the subject of a whole different speech.
I'm attempting to establish that it should be part of the cultural issue that you're addressing.
I think perhaps you're asking the government to extend the definition of British values, which is outside my remit.
Two gentlemen down the middle aisle. Yep. Name and organisation.
Stuart Collett, Manchester Rules. I've had a number of arguments with Ofsted in recent times over issues of let's call it perceptions amongst the Jewish community have been picked on. I don't believe that many people think that Ofsted have been acting well. My question really is how are you going to be able to get rid of these perceptions amongst other communities, as well as the Jewish community? I think being as supportive as we can.
It's a toughie, but we do put an immense amount of time and effort into our engagement work with a lot of different groups and communities to help get rid of myths that build up. We go out and talk to people. My regional directors speak in a lot of places. I speak in a lot of places. We have a specialist team that works with a lot of the faith-based independent schools. I think we put a great deal of resource and effort into trying to make sure that we are as constructive as possible in this space.
I'm Paul Twyman here, I suppose, in my role as citizen. Thinking about values, have you got any thoughts on when we should start teaching them? I've got in mind that when I listened to my 5-year-old grandson coming back from his school, he's started to grasp some of these values in his modern life. And Key Stage 3 is all very well, and I'm just wondering whether you reckon some of this stuff should kick in very much earlier.
I think some of these concepts absolutely do kick in much earlier. The very basic idea that rules apply to everybody on the same basis is something that most children encounter very early on at school, and the tension between that and individual liberty. Most children will sort of get the idea at primary school of the majority decision that where different people want different things, that if more people want one than the other, then by default the larger group will generally prevail. No, I think that there absolutely is space, and for history, the kind of study that children have in primary schools should definitely start exposing them to these.
We started on time. I'm determined to end on time, so maybe if we have a brace more of questions, mainly in the middle there, taking as a clock.
Sorry, I didn't hear.
Sorry, Yvonne Kennedy, Languages Advisor for Arts Learning. You talked in the commander about humanities and the impact. So I've got a question. My question is, should more be done to make explicit and to exploit the opportunities that exist within languages curriculum in schools to uphold the values being discussed here this evening, thinking about things like the development of cultural agility and intercultural understanding in students?
One other person just behind you there somewhere. Someone else had their hand up. Yeah, gentleman at the back. Name and organism.
David, you're being very shy.
I wanted to reinforce what Joanna said. British values are obviously as far as they go the same. It does rather remind me of European diplomacies and institutional pragmatism. You have no notion of content at all. Constitutional pragmatism was invented for a country that really didn't like itself very much. Unfortunately, we aren't in that position, and you need some degree of emotional satisfaction. Otherwise, the devil has all best humans, and the emotional attraction of the experience was so powerful, and we're not. This isn't really for Ofsted, but is there something the flags and the songs and the symbols and the doing things together? We see obviously in great the Olympics in 2012 and now in the World Cup. Is there anything that our schools should be thinking about? We're not going to start saluting the flag again, but singing Jerusalem.
Well, indeed. To take your points first, I absolutely think one of the interesting things is that we look at the culture and ethos of a school, and one of the characteristics of really good schools is that they create that intense, sort of positive culture in various ways, and there is no reason why some of these themes shouldn't be reflected in the among the levers that a school uses to create that culture. But as you say, beyond that, it slightly falls outside anything that I can recommend. On languages, my first hope would be to see lots and lots of children learning languages, and see everybody carrying on with languages through their much longer through their education and reaching a very good level. So that's my top priority. If schools are then also able to use it to build some of the cultural understanding, that's great. But first off, can we have lots of children learning them?
Thank you. Well, even I know there are many in this room of ardent secularists, even atheistic opinion. I'm sure they'll agree that it is a modern miracle that any event discussing community cohesion should end on time. That is partly due to the admirable concision of Amanda's lecture, her answers, a very important contribution to debate. We're delighted to have hosted. Please join me in expressing appreciation.